Today's July 18th in the year 2011. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television, and it is my great pleasure to be interviewing William Froug here at his home in Sarasota, Florida.
My great pleasure to be here, believe me, and surprise.
Well, we're going to start right from the beginning, Bill. What was your name at birth?
My name at birth was William Froug.
Any middle name?
No middle name.
When were you born?
May 26, 1922.
Where?
Little Rock, Arkansas.
Is that where you grew up?
Yes. Having said that, it's all a lie. I mean, literally. I didn't know it, but actually, the real person, I was born in New York, actually, adopted and taken to Little Rock. My birth name was John Krause, Krause.
Did you ever meet your birth parents?
No, never knew about them until I was in college.
So who raised you? Talk about who raised you? Talk about your parents.
Oh, my parents were Rita and Bill Froug, the two greatest people in history. They were just wonderful.
And what made them great to you?
They were loving, supportive, 100% supportive, and approval 100% of the time. They taught me values that were very simple. I'd say, what'll I do, in these tough questions. And they always said the same thing. It drove me crazy. They always said, we know you'll do the right thing. That was their motto. We know you'll do the right thing. And I say, you're driving me crazy with this. We know you'll do the right thing. And I had to struggle out to figure what the right thing was. Then whatever I did was fine with them.
What interests did you have growing up?
I had my interest with playing. I was a real player. I was biking, roller skating. I was hyperactive, actually.
Were you interested in the movies or entertainment at all?
Oh, yeah, I loved the movies. I was madly in love with movies.
Oh, and did you move your hands?
I'm sorry, I'm in the way of the mic.
Yeah. I'm sorry, you were talking about movies and how important they were to you.
Oh, gosh, yes. I adored movies. Every Saturday was a movie.
Were you an avid reader?
Yes, I became an avid reader in my teens, and especially in the Navy. I was in the Navy for 3 years, and I was on a subchaser, and I read constantly. I just was nuts about reading because there was nothing else to do. You're out in the Pacific patrolling back and forth, and I became an avid reader.
Were there specific kinds of writing that really appealed to you?
Yes, I was a big Damon Runyon fan. I read everything he wrote, and I was into basically popular literature. I didn't read much of the classics. Whatever was in the ship's library, and the ship had a crew of 60 and 6 officers, so it was a very small ship, but it was paradise.
And what about your schooling? Talk a little bit about that.
I went to school in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I was mediocre, and my parents were always called in to complain that I wasn't making straight A's because I had a IQ for A's. Never made A's. I was lazy as could be. That was my hallmark. Avoid work at all costs. So I became a writer, naturally.
Did you go to college?
I went to the University of Missouri Journalism School, thanks in part to my dad, who reminded me that my cousin was engaged to the president of one of the fraternities. Ergo, I should go to Columbia, Missouri, where Donald Galamba, Galumba, Galamba was the president of the school, of a college, of a fraternity. So I went. I pledged the fraternity and quit right away because I hated fraternity life. I became an independent, proudly.
And what led you to journalism?
Actually, I just started writing. I don't know, but there was some word went around that they were doing what they called the J Show, which was a journalism school's annual production. And for no reason I can think of, I sat down and wrote it. It was about 19 or 20, I don't know. And I wrote the J Show, and it was fun, and it was produced. It became a musical. It was like, I think it had a weekend run, whatever, but it was a big hit. So gradually, as a friend of mine said, I didn't find writing, writing found me. True. I didn't plan to be a writer, but writing certainly grabbed me by the throat. And I kept writing.
So how does a kid from Arkansas end up in Hollywood?
Oh, well, actually, because my college roommate was a successful radio writer in Hollywood. And I sat down one day, not planning it. This sentence kept bugging me. I was on the subchaser. And I watched them shooting sharks, the crew, and I saw this huge shark shot and roll over. Must have been at least 15 feet, a big shark. And this sentence hit me. Anybody who looks at dead bodies long enough is bound to get tired of it sooner or later. Don't ask me, but that sentence stuck with me. And I had to go downstairs. I brought my loyal portable typewriter, which must have told me something. Hauled out the typewriter and wrote, anybody that looks at dead bodies is bound to get tired of it sooner or later. And it became a novel, a mystery novel, making it up sentence at a time.
And it was published?
Yeah. Amazing. $300. Cover story in New Detective magazine. Fun.
Did that get you out to Hollywood?
Indirectly, yes, because I sent it to my college roommate, who was already working as a radio writer in Hollywood.
What is his name?
E. Jack Newman, Neuman. A dear friend, and he'd been writing radio. He'd had a tragic medical accident. He was in the Marine Corps during the war, and they discovered a spot on his lung. He had Rocky Mountain spotted fever because he'd been bitten by a tick. He was from Denver while he played in the woods, and he spent the war years as a Marine in the hospital. He spent 3 years in a VA hospital, and we kept writing back and forth. I sent him this making it up as I went along novel, and he loved it. And he said, "Send me the whole novel. I'll get it published immediately." And he did. He got an agent at once, and became the cover story in New Detective magazine. Big thrill. April 1946, cover story. Now that was exciting. $300. That was exciting.
And where were you at the time? Were you still living?
I was in the Navy, and so I got discharged in Hollywood and moved in with Jack and his mother, who lived in a pull-down bed in the living room. Aggie, we loved Aggie. And one day Aggie said, "Billy, you're going to have to move out. I'm tired of living in a pull-down bed in the living room." So I got married, foolishly. Anyway, that's how I got to Hollywood. Moved in with E. Jack. We wrote radio for a while together, a few months, and then we each branched out. He was writing Lux Radio Theater, and he was getting $600 a script. So I started writing unsponsored radio scripts for CBS, and I was getting $90 a script. That was big money, $90 a script. And I began to sell them, and I went to work as a publicist for CBS. And, I got a job at $83.50 a week. And then one day, CBS, the writing staff for CBS Pacific Coast, CBS Radio Pacific Coast, came to me and said, "We have an opening, $82.50 a week as a staff writer." I couldn't pass up the advance. So quickly I said, "Sign me up." So I took $1 a week loss and became a staff writer. Now that was the best thing I ever did. And I was turning out a half-hour radio mystery every week. Loved it.
What was the secret to writing for radio?
What's the secret? I think the secret is just keep making it up as you go along. I really do. It's one sentence at a time. I never had an outline for anything I ever did. Ever. Just start writing. If you can entertain yourself, there's a chance you can entertain somebody else. That was my philosophy. I kept myself amused, and I'm a short attention span guy. But each sentence would surprise me. I never knew what was going to happen next, and that kept me going. If I'd had an outline, I would have dropped it long ago.
Did you write for any specific series, or how did that all work?
Well, in the beginning, I wrote for a series called Jeff Regan Investigator. And Jeff Regan Investigator was a private eye. And pretty soon, I was alternating. There was half-hour scripts. Pretty soon, I was alternating with some other people on the second floor, which was where the writing staff was. This was Columbia Pacific Radio, because in those days, CBS Radio had a Pacific network for that time zone on the West Coast, and then it had the regular network for the East Coast. So we were on Pacific Coast Network, and it was fun. We had our own schedule, different from the regular schedule. So we did our own shows, $90 a pop.
What were some of the other shows that were playing on CBS at the time?
Well, of course, the ultimate hit was Lux Radio Theater. My pal and lifelong friend was writing Lux Radio Theater and getting $400 a script. He was big time. And that was done right out of Lux Radio Theater on Vine Street. They had their own theater. And, radio days were very different, but it was fun.
Did you, in your book, you mentioned that you saw the first Gunsmoke script for radio?
Yes, I was working as a junior executive. They'd upped me to assistant program director, some such title. And they handed me the script and said, "What do you think?" And it was Gunsmoke. And it blew my mind. It was a radio script. I said, "My God, this is unbelievable." It was written by a guy who I became a lifelong friend, Walter Brown Newman. And all the characters who subsequently were in the radio and television series for over 20 years were in that first script. I read that script and said, this is a must-do script. And everybody who read it felt the same way. So it began as a radio drama, and it was a big, big hit. Bill Conrad was the actor who played Matt Dillon. And I learned radio writing from reading Walter Brown Newman's radio scripts, because he could get more out of a line than any man I ever knew. He could do 3 lines of a character and you knew the whole character. A real gift. I never was in that league, ever.
And you mentioned that you were becoming a junior executive at that time.
Well, gradually, as I became successful, they were not content to leave me be. They upped me to being assistant to Guy Della Chapa, the vice president of programs. And I know what happened is the guy who who produced and directed Hallmark Radio Hall of Fame on Sunday night on CBS Radio had bombed badly, and the ratings had plummeted because they were doing all these old-fashioned stories with all the actors appeared to be wearing white wigs. The radio actors, it was just a bore. And the executive in charge of the program from Foot, Cone, and Belding, a guy named Bert Oliver, said, "Listen, I like your ideas. You want to take over this show? I never produced or directed anything in my life." I said, "You bet." So he said, "It's yours." Just like that, I became producer-director of Sunday Night Radio Hall of Fame. And I switched to contemporary stories. I did a story with Joe DiMaggio narrating. I did a story about the death of George Gershwin, and with Ira Gershwin narrating. Nothing like that had ever been done. I did the story Breaking the Sound Barrier with the guy who broke the sound barrier narrating. So I shot the show right up to #1, and it was so easy. I just brought on real people and got rid of the wigs.
So you were writing them and producing them?
No, I was rarely writing and mostly producing and directing, which I loved. I took to it right away, and it had the time of my life. It was mine. I could do anything I wanted. The sponsor was so happy at the leap in the ratings that he said, "Whatever you want to do." I had that the rest of my life. He never once said, "Don't do this."
Can you take the battery off that?
I loved.
It's. Do you want to stop? Hey, stop.
3.
All right, we are just testing.
Okay, we're back on. We were talking about Hallmark and how successful you were with that. Was that your main program that you were doing as an executive?
That was Sunday afternoon, done live in front of an audience of 600 people. Lionel Barrymore was a host, and he was a delight. He sat behind a desk because arthritis had totally crippled him. He was in a wheelchair. So he did all his show sitting behind a desk. And he was a fountain of dirty jokes. And my God, he never stopped. The ribald jokes just went on and on and on. And we all were laughing ourselves silly during the rehearsal. So I made a tape of him with his dirty jokes, which I've lost, I'm sorry to say. But Barrymore, who was a grumpy old curmudgeon, he liked to be. And one day I just started, and I'd never produced or directed anything. I was nervous as hell, and I'm in the control booth, and we're going to have an audience of 600 people out there. And everybody's set, and the orchestra, we had everything. And I'm nervous, and it's going to be live, it always was, in front of an audience. So Lionel, it's as always in the middle of a dirty joke during rehearsal. And I hit the talkback, which boomed out all over the place, and said, "Quiet on the set." And he started laughing. He said, "Will you listen to that fucking kid?" He said, "Listen to that fucking kid." He laughed himself, so of course so did I. So we hit it off right away.
Oh, that's great. Who were some of the other writers that you were working with at that time?
Various writers. Jim Poe, who later won an Oscar for a movie about the little blind girl. I can't remember. I think that was the movie. Anyway, Jim was one of my writers, and we were friends for life. And he later won an Oscar. But anyway, various writers. I did one or two of them. I forget.
And that was also around the time of the Blacklist and McCarthyism.
Wow.
Yeah, did you have any experiences with that?
Oh, yes. Horror. The most terrifying period in history of Hollywood. How terrifying, as I've eventually become a vice president of programming, which was a squabble because they were paying me $600 a week to produce and direct Hallmark. And the pay for the vice president was like $300 a week. And I said, "No, thanks." And they said, "Yes, but we want you here as vice president of West Coast." I said, "Well, then you got to let me keep both checks." And they did. So suddenly in radio I was making $1,000 a week. It was just great. But along came the Blacklist. And we were required to have a copy of Red Channels on our desk at all times.
Visible?
Red Channels was the official book that listed all the suspected communists, or SIMCOMs as we call them, sympathetic to communism. It was all bullshit. But we had to have it on the desk to prove our loyalty. And everybody at CBS had to sign a loyalty oath. I wrote a letter of protest with mine, didn't mean anything. And one of our secretaries refused to sign it. But she didn't get fired, and nothing happened to any of us who protested. But CBS had to put up a show. We had to show we were really loyal. And I just sent him a letter saying, this is to advise you. I was in the Navy for 3 years in the Pacific. I don't have to prove to you that I'm an American citizen. And I wrote a very strong letter, and I got a letter back from their legal department saying, we admire and respect your opinions, but we'd like you to sign the loyalty oath. So I made my point and I signed it. But I hated myself for doing it. It was a frightening period. Every actor had to be approved you had to check them out against the Red Channels, which was the official book of SIMCOMs, Sympathetic Communism. And I had the book on my desk. I never looked at it because I said, who cares about radio? Nobody did. That was really aimed at the movie studios. So we went around business as usual. One guy, Ronald Reagan's brother, was in charge of the local blacklist. And he would come around the office. He was a friendly guy. He'd say, I'm just checking. I said, check, and he'd look over the cast list. I said, check all you want. You're not going to find anybody in the book. And he finally said, okay. So he stopped checking. But that was his concession.
Did you ever use someone that was in the book that you just didn't know, or that they called you on?
Yes, I used someone consistently as my favorite producer-director named William Spear, S-P-I-E-R, or William Robeson, both of them. Robeson, R-O-B-S-E-N, was blacklisted, and I kept him going, working for CBS throughout the blacklist, because he was my friend and he was superb at his work. I didn't give a damn. What were they going to do with radio? Who cared about radio?
And why is it that no one was caring about radio anymore?
Pardon me?
Why is it that no one was caring about radio anymore?
Because television had come in, and radio was yesterday, and we all knew it. It was yesterday's news, and nobody gave a damn. So we went about our business. We knew that nothing we did was going to cause any stir anyway. There had been some flurries. There was a law firm in Hollywood, Martin, I can't think of his last name, who was the official clearer for the committee. Martin Gang, G-A-N-G. If you wanted to get approved, you went to Martin Gang, and he was the back channel to the House Un-American Activities Committee. And mysteriously, if you went to Martin Gang and he cleared you, then you could go ahead and use the actor. Although his family would deny it, that's what he was. He was a Hollywood liaison to the Un-American Activities Committee. He was above reproach, a very straight. I liked Martin Gang. He was a nice guy. But he set himself up as the official clearinghouse. It was a terrible time.
How did you know when it was over?
It just faded. It never officially became over. Gradually, we all began to pay less and less attention to it, and it became irrelevant. You know, that idiot in Buffalo who initiated it, the guy who had the market that started the whole thing, died, and that helped. And gradually, the committee couldn't get much traction. They raised a lot of hell, as you know, in Hollywood, but nobody cared much about radio, so it just vanished. It was alive in the 50s, by the way. There was still talk about it. In the height of it, we'd go to lunch, a bunch of us writers, and we whispered when we talked about the House Un-American Activities, for fear we'd be overheard. We didn't doubt there'd be some spies around. But anyway, it vanished because nobody paid attention.
Now, you were saying that the radio was kind of ending for you. How did you move into television?
Well, necessity. I knew that the market was fading, and I had loved radio, but I had to become aware of the fact that my favorite form was out. So I wrote a script that I particularly liked, based on fictitious based on real characters in Oklahoma that I'd obliquely heard about, and made them into characters for a radio drama. And I liked it, so I changed it into a television drama and sold it to Bill Asher, who was the producer of Jane Wyman's Fireside Theater. And he bought it. And it became my first television script. It was a big thrill. I just adapted the radio script to television.
Well, did it air pretty much as you wrote it? You remember?
Pretty much, except this is silly. The director didn't know it was a comedy. It was a farce. The script was a farce, so he directed it as if it was a serious Western. And it was everything was, they went that away, every cliche I could use. And I was laughing myself silly as I wrote it. And then came the stinger. John Crosby was the leading critic of the day for the New York Times, the television critic. And he wrote a column, so help me God, saying this is about the way it started. Somewhere in Hollywood, there's a writer lying by a swimming pool while he thinks up cliches like Pahuska, that was the name of it. Like in Pahuska, the Jane Wyman blunder, a ripping, tearing indictment of my show. He didn't even realize it was a comedy. It was a farce. That was my introduction.
Did you defend yourself at all? Or
no, never said a word. Wasn't any point. It was in the New York Times, and my family loved it because they saw what it was. It didn't mean anything, but it was kind of an awesome debut. Awful debut.
Did you want to remain in television? Did you enjoy that experience enough to want to really...
Oh, it wasn't a question of remaining. You want to make a living, and you're a writer. You go where the market is. It's not a maybe.
So then you went to Screen Gems. Is that your first actual job?
Yeah, Screen Gems came to me in the form of a writer-producer named Billy Sackheim, who was shopping around for producers and came up with the great idea of finding writers who he could convert into producers. So he called me over. He had heard my production of Brave New World, which had won me a lot of pages of kudos. 4 columns in the New York Times, for example. It's listed as the 4th best radio broadcast in history. And that's pretty good. I love that. I wrote, produced, and directed it, and Aldous Huxley narrated it, and it's the highlight of my life.
Really?
By far.
What made it so great, do you think?
The property. Brave New World with Aldous Huxley, how good can you get? How can you go wrong with that? So it was the debut of a series called Columbia Workshop, which was changed to the CBS Radio Workshop, and just earned tons of columns, an entire column in Time magazine, all kinds of stuff. Huge attention. And, with Huxley narrating, how bad can it be? So I was off and running, and Billy Sackheim had heard it and called me over and said, "Are you interested in television?" And I said, "I have no choice. Radio is going down the drain, and you're what's happening." He says, "I can offer you 13 weeks at $900 a week." I said, "How soon do you want me to be here?" So I took the job, 13 weeks, $900 a week, and became a producer. I didn't know one end of a camera from the other. Never been on a sound stage, knew nothing about film whatsoever, and went to work.
How did you figure it out? Did you have somebody teaching you?
Well, I went around the stages and watched them film. I didn't know that you shot a scene and then later connected it to another scene in the cutting room. I didn't know that. I'd never seen a cutting room, so I watched the editors and absorbed this stuff. But I was as naive as you could get, and I just wrote my scripts, and they liked them, and they shot them, and I was astonished. It took no training. You start with one sentence, and you make it up as you go along.
And you were producing some of these as well?
What?
And you were producing some of these as well at that point?
I was producing them. entirely. Yeah, became a producer. That's what Screen Jim Billy Sackheim did. Very smart. He went shopping for writers who could become producers. It was a brilliant idea. So he rounded up 3 or 4 of us who were basically writers. He didn't care whether we knew anything about film at all. He just wanted somebody who knew writing. And he made some wise choices. I was with him for years, and he was an explosive tempered character, but he was, in retrospect, kind of fun. He would blow his stack, take scripts and throw them across the room, screaming and yelling about this piece of shit. You give me this piece of shit, he'd scream. He'd throw the script across the room. He'd go into a temper tantrum. And you had to laugh. The tirades, it became funny.
Okay, let's take a quick break.
That was legendary. Sackheim would get a script he didn't like, unbelievable, and he would pick it up and throw it against the wall. How dare anybody give me this shit? How dare they? Take personal offense. I loved him, but because he was right out there. Totally bald. He had a fringe of reddish hair around his bald dome. And actually a good-looking man. But really out there always. It was kind of fun. You know, you couldn't take personal offense. That's who he was. And he taught me a lot. He taught me not to give him a script unless I thought it was terrific. One thing he told me, don't give him a mediocre script. That would send him out off the wall.
Did you have to run story ideas past him before the writing would start?
Sometimes. Not always. It depended. Sometimes I'd get a script that I had no doubt. It was terrific, and I would say to him, this is terrific, and he'd read and say, you're right, go with it. Sometimes he'd say, well, you could potchkey around. That was his favorite word. Potchkey around a little bit here. Maybe make the end a little stronger. Sometimes we would get a script we couldn't fix. Is that mower?
Okay, we're back on.
All right.
Okay, so actually, talk about when you were at Screen Gems, what shows did you work on?
At Screen Gems, I was almost primarily, no, not primarily, 90% involved in Alcoa Goodyear Theater. But he also had me produce a couple of TV movies while I was there. One was a script that a buddy of his had written, which he liked, which was like half a script. And he said, you can figure this out. And another one was a police officer who had written a script, and he said to me, they love him over at Ziv, you got to like this. And I met with the guy, and we hit it off right away. His name was Gene Roddenberry, and he created a series called Star Trek, and on to Real Legend. Anyway, Gene and I worked on that script. We had a lot of fun. We even got in the car and drove out to the back lot at Columbia, looking at various sets to see if we could build more of the story around sets. Then we found a steamship dry docked out at the back lot. So we put the script on board the steamship. It was terrible, a terrible movie. But we did it. You know, in those days, Screen Gems was commissioned by CBS to fill in for Playhouse 90. Playhouse 90 on CBS had originally started out to be live shows every week. But as not surprisingly, they couldn't keep up that pace. And they needed some backup because God forbid you can't have blank airtime on television. So they commissioned Screen Gems to give them, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, whatever, movies for television to fill in for when they couldn't make the air date. And I had the happy, unhappy chore of producing 2 or 3 of those.
Yeah, I know you produced Natchez and Before I Die.
Terrible, terrible. Yeah, I did they were just examples of what we had. We had to get something on the air, and both of them were utterly forgettable. And just soon you never mention them again. Natchez was just, that was Gene Roddenberry and I painfully trying to construct a story where there was no story. And there's a footnote here that's really funny. And this is a story only Hollywood could come up with. And there was a young actor named Jack Lemmon. You've heard of him. Well, Jack Lemmon had the hots for a young actress whose name I will happily forget. And he was courting her. And Columbia wanted to make a deal with Jack Lemmon for a series of movies, which they subsequently did. But in order to entice him further, they told Screen Gems, which is where they put the garbage, they put the trash out. We'll star Felicia Farr, was her name. We'll star Felicia Farr in a couple of TV movies. Now, we had no scripts, and I was assigned to come up with a couple of TV movies to star Felicia Farr, who was a waitress at the local Dupars or something, so that they could entice Jack Lemmon to sign a contract. And indeed I did. They weren't very good. Felicia Farr was a lovely lady, no grand actress, let's put it mildly, but anyway, so really, this is so bizarre, so Hollywood. So they said to me, you got to come up with a TV movie, Felicia Farr. I said, who's Felicia Farr? They said, well, she's an actress, and she is dating Jack Lemmon, and we want Jack Lemmon to sign a contract. That's the truth. So I said, how do I see Felicia Farr? They said, you don't. We don't have any film on her. So they came to me and said, all right, let's come up with a movie for Felicia Farr. And we're laughing ourselves silly. And any suggestions? They said, yeah, there's a movie like Jezebel. You'd know, it's a famous movie with a woman's name in the title who was a famous seductress. I can't remember the movie. It was very famous at the time. And they told me the name of the movie. I don't know, call it Jezebel. It wasn't that. It was something like that. What we want is a movie like that. And I said, have you ever seen it? They said, no. I said, can I see it? They said, no. We don't want you to get sued. Don't see it. Whatever you do, don't see it. But come up with a movie like that. So that was the assignment. Come up with a movie like a movie I'd never seen and nobody had. And I did. It was terrible. So a writer and I got together and with this assignment to come up with a movie like a movie neither of us had seen. We couldn't get sued to star Felicia Farr, who nobody had seen. Because Jack Lemmon, they wanted to sign the contract. And we did. It was a dreadful movie. It was called Natchez. It was awful. And we knew it. But here we were. That was the assignment. They were paying me my money, and that's what Hollywood is partly about. Not always like that.
How was Felicia Farr as an actress?
Adequate. Nice woman, by the way. Very nice. She was okay. And during the course of this movie, a guy named Rich was the director. And he and one of the actors nearly got into a fist fight on the set. Oh, the actor, I have to think of his name, was a well-known name like Cliff. Anyhow, right now I can't think, but a young actor who they also were grooming for bigger things. And he and this director named Rich, I think it was David Lowell Rich, I can't swear to it, but I think that was it. That's a maybe. Anyhow, they came to near blows because Rich had directed this young actor to do something. I remember, put down the ashtray before you walk out. And he said, why? So he said, because you want to get rid of it, and you're going to do that, or you're going to throw it at her. And he says, I'm not going to throw it at her. So they got this big fight. And the director and the actor were shut down. They couldn't shoot because of this big dispute. So as a producer, I was called to the set. And here was a director who I think was David Lowell Rich, but I can't guarantee it. And the actor who you would know, I just can't think of his name right now. The actor, a young actor, who later sued Columbia for a missing paycheck. And it turned out he was right. I can't think of his name. Anyhow, so the director and the actor practically come to blows. They call me as the producer over the set, and everybody gets calmed down, so there is no fight. It's all about this scene. I never forget it. And they're shouting at each other. What did he throws the ashtray or not? It's silly stuff that goes on behind the scenes. I don't know why I'm telling this story.
Well, actually, it's telling what a producer does. So what?
Yeah, that's what a producer does. I'm called to the set to settle this dispute. By the time I get to the set, they've ironed it out. They're angry, but they can work together. And when they finish the picture, it's lousy. Don't look at Natchez, because that's what it is. It was terrible.
You've also worked on Dick Powell Theater.
I love that. Dick Powell was a very wise fellow. Dick had gone from a boy singer in the early days of Hollywood, even in the 30s, and with some stardom, I mean, not major, but some stardom, and turned himself into a tough guy and playing Private Eyes, and had a Murder My Sweet or something, had a big hit, and had turned himself into an executive and helped form something called Four Star, I think, with Ida Lupino, and who later became a close friend, and a couple of other actors. And he commissioned some movies. And for some reason, I got tapped to write a couple of these. And I did, and they were adequate, nothing great. And we shot them, and one of them, as it happened, starred a British actress who I'd seen on a Playhouse 90 named Hazel Court, red-headed woman, just gorgeous. And I'd seen her on a Playhouse 90 and said, I've got to write a script for this woman. And so I wrote the script, and the casting director said, Hazel Court. I said, that's exactly who I have in mind. So we brought her over from London for this part. And I'm on the set, and a guy walks over to me, and he says, thank you, thank you, thank you. He hugs me, shakes my hand. You made me the happiest man in the world. I said, what did I do? He was Don Taylor. He was an actor and sometime director. Anyway, Don said, you brought my fiance over from England. We're going to get married. I said, I'm delighted. I didn't know. So the three of us became friends for life, actually, all three of us. And she did the show, and she was fine. It wasn't very demanding, I must say. But it was one of my adequate efforts. I had a lot of adequate efforts.
Well, you also had a really great effort in Alcoa Goodyear Theater, particularly with Eddie.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, Eddie was an instant hit. The script came to me, and it was called Sammy. And it was a monologue with a guy who is a minor league hood who's desperately trying to raise $900 to pay off his bookie. And he knows the bookie is going to send some guys over to beat the shit out of him. And he's terrified. And he's on the phone trying to sell phony, cheap cashmere sweaters, anything he can think of to raise $900. And this desperation comes, it was a great script, came through. I said, got to do this script. So it had a lot of anti-Semitic overtones, which I didn't like and wouldn't stand for. So I changed it from Sammy to Eddie. And I said to Billy Sackheim, with Mickey Rooney in this part, it's a guaranteed Emmy. He said, really? It's a monologue, 30 minutes. He said, yeah, let me see it. Billy always played the skeptic. That was his front. So he gets the script, and he comes to see me the next day. He said, you're right, Mickey Rooney, guaranteed Emmy. So get him, and you got to go ahead. I said, fine. So I got a writer to come in and change Sammy into Eddie, and we shot it with Mickey Rooney in a day and a half, and Rooney was off the chart brilliant. We watched him in the dailies. All we could do, our breath would take. We said, this guy's going to win an Emmy Award. And we shot it, and he was nominated for an Emmy Award. And in a bizarre Hollywood twist, everybody connected with the show, including me, including the writer, including the director, but not Mickey Rooney. Everybody got an Emmy but Mickey. And I ran into him at the awards that night, and he's in the men's room, and he's banging the mirror in the men's room, and he's drunk. He's screaming, fuck 'em all, he's screaming. He's banging the mirror like he's going to break it. How dare they? That was my Emmy. And he's screaming and yelling. So I just walked out. But that's how an actor can sometimes act when they get bypassed. He should have gotten the Emmy. It went to Fred Astaire in a weird twist of fate.
Are there any other anthology programs that you were doing at that time that you want to bring up?
We were about the last of the anthologies, I think. Maybe Chrysler had one for a while. I can't remember the name of it. I can't remember the name of it.
But then from there, you moved on to working with Mark Goodson. Is that right? Was that
Who?
your next? Mark Goodson.
Mark Goodson?
Was that your next job after Screen Gems?
It might have been. Yeah, I'm not certain. I think so.
And talk about that. How did that come about, and what were you doing?
Well, that came about, and that's a bizarre story, really. A man named Harris Cattleman, who was Goodson Todman, were the kings of game shows. And Cattleman was their West Coast liaison. He came to me after I'd won the Emmy and that stuff. And he said, we want you to come over and head up a Goodson Todman unit here in Hollywood, and we want you to produce shows for us. I said, okay. And they offered him, the money was good, about $1,000 a week. I said, okay. So I took the job, and my office was at Metro, which I loved. I loved that studio. It was wonderful to walk in. You always knew everybody there, and they always knew you. The people at the counter in the commissary, the guards always said, hi, Bill, good morning. Good morning. Kenny Hollywood was one of the guards, and Sam Kowalski. They were just wonderful people. So we were all, it was a friendly family at Metro. Loved it. And so I go to work in an office for Goodson Todman, and I'm producing this series, and I start with a pilot for Philip Marlowe. And they already hired an actor, I forgot his name. A very good actor, blonde, handsome guy, who looked like anything but a private detective. Very handsome fellow, and you couldn't possibly picture him as a guy who was a crime fighter. Anyhow, it was all set. And I took over the show and commissioned some stories and made another pilot, which sold immediately. It was a superb script, and ABC bought it on the spot for Friday night at 9 o'clock, prime time, and it was going to be a big winner. So off we go, and Goodson Todman are telling me how great I am, how glad they are I signed on, and I'm on a year contract. So I hire another writer, because the guy who wrote the pilot, as is often the case in Hollywood, was not available to write episodes. He wrote pilots only because pilots paid like double what an episode paid. And also, if you wrote a pilot, you had a piece of the action for the series, for the run of the series. So some guys wrote only pilots, and they were the exceptions. And this guy wouldn't do the series. So I hired some writers, and they wrote some stories. And I get a word from Harris Cattleman, the West Coast operative for Goodson Todman. The Goodson hates the stories, wants no part of them. They don't have any violence. It's a private eye. There's no shooting. And he says, tell him to have Marlowe shoot some women in the stomach. So I love that. And immediately he called to raise, holy hell, what am I doing? I said, Mark, I'll be more careful from now on. I promise I'll get more Marlowe shooting women in the stomach. He said, what? He screamed. I never said that. I said, well, that's the word that came back to me. So, needless to say, I got fired pretty quick. I lasted a couple of weeks, and they paid me off. End of story.
And where did you go from there? Is that Adventures in Paradise?
Probably Adventures in Paradise, which I loved, which was the love of my life.
Well, talk about that. First of all, if someone's never seen it, can you describe the series?
Oh, yeah. It was like made for me. It was about a skipper of a private sailboat who runs inter-island in the Pacific, cargoing people or cargo from island to island, inter-island service. And Gardner McKay, who was incredibly handsome, had been magazine cover handsome, was the lead, and he had a problem. He couldn't act, but he was gorgeous to look at. And unfortunately, the word was all around. There were pictures of him in magazines, a lot of coverage, always with the note, he can't act. And it got to him after a while. He had a nervous breakdown, had to put him into the infirmary and shoot him up with drugs because he couldn't take the pressure. I understood. He had this huge dog he took everywhere. An enormous dog. I forget what kind. Very fuzzy, who he called Pussycat. Pussycat went everywhere. Anyway, Gardner was a nice guy, but the pressure of this constant he can't act was a little much for him. And he cracked up. But anyway, we pieced it all back together, and we had a series that lasted about 13 shows, and we had a wonderful time. We made up stories about the inter-island work of this skipper. Adam Troy was his name. About Adam Troy running this boat inter-island, and I wrote a half a dozen of them, I think, and I loved every minute of it because it was nonviolent. It was character stuff, and we just got to do offbeat stories, and I was having the time of my life, but unfortunately the audience wasn't. It stayed in the top 20, but never got better than top 20. So it got canceled, and that was the end of that, but it was sure fun.
And then from there you went to San Benedict?
Yeah, after that, Jack, my old college roomie, came to me and said, I got a series I just sold, and I want you to produce it. I said, what? He said, it's called Sam Benedict. I said, what's that? He said, it's a lawyer. It's based on Jake Ehrlich, who is a San Francisco attorney, high-powered attorney, who's flamboyant and so forth. Come see it. So I came to Metro. I'd just been canned, and Jack and I went to the projection room, and I looked at it and I said, it's wonderful. Eddie O'Brien played Sam Benedict. Eddie O'Brien was a wonderful actor. By the way, an equally wonderful guy. And I signed on to do that and loved it. We started doing scripts, and the network loved it. And literally, they kept saying, this is a great show. And they tested it at preview out. Off the chart hit, guaranteed hit. And it was wonderful. One little problem. The audience didn't agree. So it ran about, I forgot, I think we did maybe 26 episodes. But in those days, you get an order for 26 shows was unheard of. Today it wouldn't happen. Anyway, we did 26 hours, I think. I produced all of them. Loved every minute of it. And Jack and our relationship was for the rest of our lives. We worked well together, and it was a great experience.
It was a legal drama. Were there any special things you had to do as a producer to make sure the legal part was correct?
Well, yeah, we did. First place, Jake Ehrlich, the actual character it was based on, who was a high-powered attorney in San Francisco, went over every script and sent it back with his notes. And we had another lawyer who went over every script. So legally, we're always on firm grounds. We never even started a story without, I'd call Jake and say, we're going to do such and such a story, what do you think? He said, sounds good, go with it. He approved every story before we ordered it written. And it was a good series. My friends loved it, but nobody else. Well, some people. And, the footnote. It happened to be slotted on Saturday night opposite Jackie Gleason, which was the kiss of death slot. So we didn't have a shot, but we all did our best. I'm proud of it. It was a nice show.
How did you come to be involved in Twilight Zone? I think that was your next big step.
Well, what happened was Sam Benedict was winding down, and we realized we weren't going to get renewed. And I got a drop-by from Harris Cattleman, who was the agent involved in me getting over to do the pilot for Goodson Todman. And he said, we have an opening at Twilight Zone because the producer, I forget his name, is moving on.
Was it Burt Granite?
Burt Granite? No, before Burt Granite. I can't. Maybe Burt. I never met him. He's quitting, and we've got somebody. We need somebody to fill out the rest of the season. Are you interested? I said, you bet. And I said, I'd love to meet Rod Serling. So we set up a meeting, and the two of us hit it off just instantly. We were friends for life, always. And I took over the show, and I loved every minute of it.
Well, talk about Rod Serling. What was he like to work with?
Delightful. One of the nicest men you'll ever meet in your life. He had an endless supply of jokes. He had total recall of every joke he had ever heard in his life, and he had the ability to tell them in whatever accent was needed. He could do British, he could do Yiddish, Italian, you name it. He could tell any story in any accent perfectly. And, he'd do the comic Yiddish or comic British, and he was screaming with laughter by the time he opened his mouth. And we just hit it off instant. We were friends for life.
Okay, let's stop there to change the tape.